What are you making of all this, Omar? And thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, good to be with you, Rish. I think it seems to be a bit of a perfect storm in terms of demand significantly higher, and there's a supply which is getting, one, more expensive, and two, more complicated because of some supply chain shocks. I think this is probably something that will take some time to correct itself, but I think it will at some point.
Well, Omar, okay, this is the energy side of things. I mean, it's happening at a bad time for the country because this could hurt growth, as could the whole thing surrounding Evergrande. And I'm talking about property developers, which take up about 25 to 28% of GDP. So, I mean, how bad could it get is the question.
Well, a back of the envelope calculation in terms of GDP growth for Evergrande would be probably around 0.5%, shaving off about 0.5% in terms of GDP growth. I think in terms of Evergrande, our view is that there will be some kind of orderly restructuring. Keep in mind that this is quite large, and this obviously has some substantial spillover effects. However, we do not think that it's systemic. And comparing this, we heard quite a few people say this is China's Lehman moment, and we think this is more sensationalism than reality. We think that the scale is obviously very different. What we think will happen is that risk sentiment will obviously sour, particularly, and it has already, for Chinese real estate, and there will be a premium that will be long-lasting. We think that there will be an orderly restructuring that will prioritize protecting suppliers, some retail investors, as well as the retail clients. And there will be some open market operations to maintain liquidity within the system. But we do not think that this is systemic. We actually think that there could be some opportunities actually in the Chinese high yield segment because we're seeing an overreaction. But we think that we'll continue to see negative news flows for a while, which will pressure the market.
So Chinese bonds looking pretty attractive, and why not, right? 3, 4, 5% yield, that's looking pretty good. How about the yuan? Is it headed lower from here?
I think for the yuan, it's going to be very steady. It has been one of the steadiest currencies so far year to date. And as you know, there has been quite a bit of movement in terms of Asian currencies. Thai baht, for instance, is down 10% year to date. Chinese yuan is one of the very few which is kind of going sideways. So I think the story for the yuan will continue to be rather unexciting.
Omar, how are you advising your clients about risk? Would you say that China is the biggest risk out there?
That's a good question, Haslinda. I think China is a risk for the market in a number of ways. Again, we do not think that Evergrande will create systemic risk, but clearly there is a transition in China where the sovereign support for the credit markets and some credit issuers is at the very least less forthcoming and much more selective. And inherently there are some an increased chance of policy mistakes when that happens. We think that the Chinese policymakers draw a line in terms of not creating systemic risk. And we saw that clearly with Huarong. I think we think Evergrande will be a different story. So that's one risk. The other risk is really the fact that there will be less tailwinds for the market. We're in a situation where China is focusing on addressing some of its own internal issues. It will be less of a tailwind for global growth. We're seeing that the very ultra-accommodative monetary policy globally is turning, at the very least, less accommodative, starting with a number of central banks that have already either signaled or some of them are actually tightening. Of course, the Fed is a major market mover there. So we think that the market might going into the fourth quarter will lack certain catalyst for performance.
Omar, the question I want to ask is, okay, we saw that there was a negotiated settlement, we don't know the details of it, of onshore debt by Evergrande, but it's the offshore $83.5 million coupon payment that perhaps is more important for foreigners, because it does send out the message that perhaps the authorities in China aren't that interested in actually giving a lifeline to foreign investors, and that could have repercussions globally.
That has been an issue for Chinese bondholders since the offshore market essentially started. We think that the offshore bondholders should be taking a hit. There could be a differentiated treatment between onshore and offshore, and this is something that we have seen before in China. And you're quite right. This is something that will leave a sour taste in terms of for the offshore bondholders, and it will create a premium for some of the Chinese assets, Chinese bonds. But I think in terms of the broader policy message that the Chinese are trying to send is that they are serious about being much more selective in terms of supporting some of the creditors, particularly those that they feel are violating the 3 red lines, which is often discussed nowadays. So yes, the reality is that the offshore bondholders are likely to take a hit.